1976, the city of Sacramento, California, was considered one of the safest places in a prosperous and thriving state. But everything changed when the brutal murders of a young woman named Sharon Barnes and her friend, Dolores Vargas, were discovered. The killer had entered their home without a trace, leaving only horrors behind. The police were powerless in the face of this mysterious crime, which revealed little, and people began to suspect that this was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a series of crimes that would shake California for decades. The horrific murder of Sharon and Dolores sent waves of terror through the city. Over time, the killer began to display a repeating pattern in each crime. He would sneak into homes through the windows at night, targeting couples. Each victim would experience fear and panic before losing their life in a terrifying way. The police began to notice that these crimes were not just about murder, but were shrouded in riddles, increasing their suspicions that the killer was following a specific method. And these crimes were perhaps part of something larger. As the crimes increased, investigators started to discover that the killer always followed the same method. He would break into homes through the windows in the dead of night, targeting couples in their beds. The crimes were marked by a level of brutal precision, leading investigators to question whether the killer was a professional. Suspicion continued to mount. Despite the police's efforts to crack the case, the killer remained in the shadows, disappearing and leaving behind even more unanswered questions. As the crimes piled up, fear began to seep into everyone's hearts. Sacramento residents lived in constant tension, watching their windows and doors with wary eyes. News of the serial killer spread quickly among the people, but the police, despite extensive investigations, could not find any tangible evidence to identify the criminal. The Golden State Killer, as he would later be called, instilled fear into the city, making even the bravest feel helpless. The entire city lived in a state of constant vigilance. Years passed, and with them, the killer continued his crimes with cold detachment. The murders increased in various cities across California, making it harder for the police to link the killer to each incident. It seemed as if he was choosing his victims randomly, but a closer analysis of the events revealed a common pattern across all the crimes. The Golden State Killer was moving from city to city, leaving very few traces, making the police's efforts to stop him even more difficult. Amid this growing terror, the killer continued to evade justice. The police began to piece together clues that could lead to identifying the killer, but all they had were vague descriptions from survivors. Everyone described a man with an athletic build, in his 30s. As time passed, these descriptions became even more elusive, with no eyewitnesses able to provide detailed accounts of the killer. The more information was gathered, the more he seemed to slip further from view, proving once again that he was like a nightmare that refused to be revealed. Over time, investigations began to take a different turn. The pressure on the police increased as the public demanded the Golden State Killer be apprehended. The crimes continued without explanation, and the police began re-examining old evidence in hopes of finding something new. During this period, investigators were betting on finding a piece of evidence that could link the killer to each murder. But it was not easy, as the killer had become increasingly skilled at erasing any trace of his crimes. In the years that followed, the series of crimes continued unabated. The victims ranged in age and background, but the killer never faltered in his violent methods. There was growing suspicion that the crimes were not isolated incidents, but part of a calculated plan. Some victims miraculously survived, but left behind harrowing testimonies of what had transpired. Amid this chaos, the killer remained in the shadows, still unmasked. On one occasion, the killer broke his silence and decided to contact the media. He sent threatening letters filled with mockery and disdain, as if mocking the investigation's progress. These letters added a psychological dimension to the mystery of the Golden State Killer. He seemed to aim not only at killing, but at playing a psychological game that tied both the police and the public in knots, sowing terror with each word. By the end of the 1970s, the Golden State Killer began to vanish from view. Not only did the crimes stop, but they disappeared completely. This sudden disappearance gave the police and the public a momentary sense of relief. But deep down, they knew this calm could be the calm before the storm. Had the killer stopped killing, or was he planning something bigger? That was the question haunting everyone, increasing anxiety and fear. In the 1990s, with advancements in technology, investigators began to reopen old cases. DNA testing became a powerful new tool for the police. Attention turned to new possibilities. Could DNA be the key to revealing the killer's identity after decades of investigation? Investigators held on to hope, but time had passed. Investigators focused on genetic evidence in an attempt to reveal the killer's identity. The evidence gathered over the years was considered an important lead that could potentially solve the case. DNA analysis revealed for the first time a match to a man named Joseph DeAngelo, a man in his 70s. This discovery turned everything upside down. In 2018, after 40 years of brutal crimes, Joseph DeAngelo was finally arrested. The man who had lived in the shadows all those years, hiding behind a veil of silence, was the same killer who had committed those horrific crimes. The story that had remained a terrifying mystery for decades came to a shocking end. One of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history was closed. During the trial, Joseph DeAngelo confessed to the crimes, acknowledging every detail, exposing the true face of the man who had terrorized California. His confession was a form of exoneration for the families who had lived in fear for decades, and the Golden State Killer was finally behind bars. This confession was not only a victory for justice, but also a turning point in serial killer investigations. After 40 years of investigations, the authorities officially closed the case, announcing the end of one of the most controversial crime stories in U.S. history. In 2018, the Golden State Killer case in Sacramento, California, was officially closed after the perpetrator was captured and brought to justice. Source of the case: the Golden State Killer case was opened in 1976 after the first murder linked to the killer in Sacramento, California, United States. Investigations continued for decades, with the killer committing several horrific crimes across various locations in California. The case was closed in 2018 after Joseph DeAngelo was arrested using DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes. The police were finally able to link him to the murders after 40 years of ongoing investigations. So, the case was opened in 1976 and officially closed in 2018 in California, United States.